The engagement photo hung above the marble countertop like a framed promise. Evan Mercer in a navy suit, Sloane Harrington in white silk that caught light like confession. The shot had been taken at a rooftop event in Soho, an evening arranged by one of her brand sponsors. The photographer had asked them to look at each other, like you've already made it. Sloane had smiled effortlessly. Evan had done his best imitation of a rival. Evan came from Ohio, flat skylines, polite distances, and steady paychecks. His hands still remembered the weight of grocery bags instead of champagne flutes. When he moved to New York for a data engineering position, he thought merit was a language everyone respected. Then he met Sloane at a product launch for a luxury wellness app, where she spoke about curated authenticity as if it were scripture. She had the kind of confidence that made silence around her feel like applause. He loved her first for her fluency in the world he could never name. She navigated conversation like choreography, weaving statistics with flattery, power with grace. "You don't have to perform," she told him once after an event, brushing lint from his jacket. "Just observe. You're the quiet kind of impressive." He believed her, until he realized that in her world, quiet often meant invisible. Their apartment on the Upper East Side was half hers, half sponsored. The furniture arrived in press boxes. The wine was tagged for promotion. Even dinners felt transactional, each photo posted before the food cooled. Evan learned to smile before swallowing, to measure success by engagement metrics, to trade sincerity for polish. When colleagues asked about his fiancée, he said she works in storytelling, because marketing felt too small a word for how she bent reality to her will. But beneath the polish, he felt the faint hum of displacement. Her friends talked about legacy and leverage, words that slid off his tongue like foreign currency. He tried to belong, practicing their idioms, their easy disdain for modest ambition. He built dashboards by day and studied Sloane's world by night, learning that beauty here wasn't a gift. It was a weapon sharpened by opportunity. Sometimes, late at night, when she fell asleep beside him under a linen duvet gifted by a designer she'd once dated, Evan scrolled through her old interviews. "Success is about alignment," she said in one clip, her voice polished to perfection. "Knowing what looks right with what feels right." He paused on the word looks. In her universe, everything was staged lighting, even sincerity. And yet, he loved her. Or at least the version he thought love could be, in a city where every gesture came with a caption. He told himself he was lucky, that proximity to her brilliance might elevate him. But on quiet subway rides home from work, with his reflection flickering in the window, he sometimes caught a different expression, not admiration, not envy, just a slow erosion of self, disguised as devotion. He adjusted. He mimicked her rhythm, her tone, her conviction. He started talking about narratives at meetings, quoting her lines about emotional resonance in data. His boss noticed. Promotions followed. Sloane said she was proud of him. Still, something in her eyes hinted at measurement, as if pride were a commodity she distributed by performance. At parties, when introductions circled back to him, she'd laugh softly. "Evan's the numbers guy who keeps me honest." The room laughed too. He smiled, because that was the script. But under the laughter lay the same truth he couldn't name, the one that sat in his chest like unspent anger. He was a guest in his own life, waiting for permission to stay. And so he played his part. He learned the dress codes, the pauses, the calibrated modesty of people who never feared losing ground. From the outside, they looked perfect, New York's photogenic synthesis of intellect and ambition. But behind every polished post, Evan felt the tremor of imbalance, love that required translation, belonging that demanded disguise. He didn't yet know that every bright cover hides its fracture, that the truest cracks begin not with betrayal, but with the quiet decision to pretend nothing's missing. The first crack didn't sound like shattering. It arrived as a whisper through a Bluetooth speaker. Evan had been cleaning the kitchen that Sunday morning, sleeves rolled to the elbows, the smell of detergent still clinging to his hands. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint ping of Sloane's phone on the counter. She'd left for a bar class downtown, her voice still echoing in his head from earlier. Don't forget, Bo's team call is synced to my calendar. Don't mess up the reminders, okay? A notification flashed. New voice memo, Bo Larkin. He didn't mean to listen. He meant to swipe it away. But the message auto-played through the speaker, her voice low and deliberate, recorded as if she were speaking into someone's ear. He'll never be enough, Bo. Not for the life we're building. Then silence. The kind that doesn't just fill a room. It drains it. Evan stood there, motionless, a sponge dripping soapy water onto the marble island. His first instinct wasn't anger. It was confusion, as if he'd misheard, misinterpreted, misexisted. The phrase repeated itself in his head, each loop stripping a layer off his chest. He paused the message, replayed it once more, and the confirmation hit like static. Sloane's tone wasn't cruel, just certain, professional even, like she was finalizing a decision already made. He stared at her phone for a long time, his pulse a metronome of disbelief. Who was Bo Larkin, exactly? Evan knew the name from event placards and Instagram tags. Venture capitalist, married, donor. He'd been at their engagement party, shaking Evan's hand, while his other stayed buried in his suit pocket. Sloane had called him a friend of the brand. The mind does strange arithmetic when wounded. Evan began tallying backward. The late dinners for campaign coordination, the hotel stays during brand retreats, the way she silenced her phone in his presence. He tried to rationalize it, clinging to the fragile logic that maybe he'd overheard a line taken out of context, a rehearsal for a pitch, a test recording. But his gut had already translated the subtext. She wasn't just cheating with a man. She was conspiring with a mirror of everything he wasn't born into. That afternoon, he opened her shared calendar under the pretense of confirming logistics. He noticed patterns, recurring strategy lunches that aligned neatly with Bo's travel itinerary, timestamps that mirrored her influencer focus groups. He remembered once picking her up early from a rooftop bar, where she said she was celebrating a milestone. The scent on her that night hadn't been her perfume. It was woodsy, unfamiliar, like someone else's cologne filtered through champagne. Evan didn't confront her. He couldn't. Not yet. He moved through the next days as though auditioning for his own life, performing calmness with perfect diction. He still made their morning coffee, still brushed her hair off her shoulder when she read emails over breakfast. But his gaze lingered on the details he'd once loved. The way she curated her laughter, how she let silence sit just long enough to make people lean in, the precision of her half-truths. Every small inconsistency became a symptom. Her polished phone calls behind closed doors, the seamless transitions from warmth to distance like flipping between brands. When she spoke to him about their future, her eyes flickered, not from guilt, but from calculation, as if weighing the optics of staying. At night, Evan would lie awake listening to the soft rhythm of her breathing beside him. He'd trace the outline of her back, feeling both tenderness and estrangement. There was still love somewhere in him, but it had curdled into awareness. He realized jealousy wasn't the poison. It was the proof that he'd been alive, invested, believing in a version of them that maybe never existed. He began to collect evidence, not of infidelity, but of erosion. Screenshots, emails, times and dates. The engineer in him couldn't resist the compulsion to map what the lover refused to see. Yet every discovery brought less satisfaction, not more. It wasn't vengeance that grew inside him. It was clarity, raw and unsparing. He remembered her voice again, that measured sentence that no apology could unmake. He'll never be enough. It wasn't just an indictment. It was prophecy. And for the first time, Evan began to wonder if her words were only half wrong. Maybe he wouldn't be enough. For her world, her metrics, her definition of worth. But maybe, just maybe, that realization was the beginning of something truer than her version of love. Evan spent the next week moving through life like a ghost with perfect manners. He still showed up at work, still smiled at the barista who knew his order by heart, still replied to Sloane's texts with measured warmth. But underneath that surface civility, something had shifted. A quiet, analytical current pulling him inward, toward the only terrain he understood better than emotion: data. He began to trace the edges of her world through spreadsheets and metadata, the same way a forensics expert might reconstruct a crime from fragments. At first, it was almost accidental. One night, while reviewing a set of engagement reports for an influencer campaign Sloane had asked him to clean up, he noticed the numbers didn't follow natural behavior curves. Likes spiked in unnatural bursts, timestamps repeating in neat 15-minute clusters, too symmetrical to be organic. He zoomed in, cross-referencing IP logs, and found the source pattern tracing back to a marketing bot farm registered under a shell vendor Bo's firm had funded. The realization didn't come as shock. It came as inevitability. Sloane hadn't been asking him to optimize efficiency. She'd been asking him to fabricate applause. Every algorithm, every cleaned report, every insight deck he'd polished for her campaigns wasn't just branding. It was complicity. And Bo, sitting in the boardroom across town, likely applauded her for the illusion he'd helped her build. That night, he opened her laptop while she showered. His hands shook, not from fear of being caught, but from the recognition that he'd already crossed an invisible line. The folder names glowed like small betrayals. Quarterly Sentiment Final, Bo Revisions, Donor Story. DocX. He scrolled through drafts where Sloane's tone shifted depending on her audience. Earnest for investors, sultry for Bo. Each paragraph bled with ambition disguised as intimacy. He stopped at one email chain. Thanks for massaging the numbers, E. Couldn't have done it without you. S. Below it, Bo's reply. He's talented, maybe too loyal. Evan stared until the words blurred. The line between professional exploitation and personal betrayal dissolved. He wasn't just the man she'd doubted. He was the system she'd used. Sleep abandoned him for days. He replayed every conversation, every "trust me" she'd whispered into his neck after long nights of work. He remembered the way she said "we" when speaking of her campaigns, and how that same word fell silent when she spoke of their marriage. The betrayal wasn't just infidelity, it was the quiet theft of purpose, the way she'd turned his craft into camouflage for her deception. But even in his fury, he hesitated. What did justice mean in a world built on curated narratives? To expose her was to stage a scene, to give her what she understood best: spectacle. To stay silent was to rot slowly in the truth. He opened his laptop and began organizing evidence: emails, graphs, client invoices, timestamps. The engineer in him found grim satisfaction in the precision. Yet as the folder grew, so did his doubt. He imagined the headlines, the gossip, the hollow triumph. He pictured Sloane's eyes the moment she realized it was him who'd undone her. And instead of victory, he felt nausea. Justice, he realized, had become tangled with revenge, and both were indistinguishable from grief. One night, while the city outside pulsed with sirens and laughter, Evan sat at his desk and drafted an anonymous report for compliance. He didn't send it. His finger hovered over the key, frozen between ruin and relief. He thought of her asleep in the next room, her face unguarded, her ambition momentarily dimmed. For the first time, he wondered if his anger was just another form of devotion, one last attempt to be seen by her, even if through destruction. He closed the laptop. The hum of the hard drive sounded almost like breathing. There, in the flickering blue of the screen, Evan finally understood what haunted him most. Not that Sloane had lied, but that somewhere along the way, he had too. He'd lied about what kind of man he wanted to be. One who fought with integrity, not performance. One who built truth, not mirrors. And yet, the mirror waited. The evidence was there, lined up like soldiers awaiting command. Justice or spectacle. The decision would define the kind of man he'd become, and he was no longer sure which version she deserved, or which version of himself he could still live with. The restaurant glowed in soft amber light, the kind meant to flatter faces and blur sincerity. The rehearsal dinner had been booked months in advance at one of Sloane's favorite venues, a sleek rooftop in Tribeca overlooking the Hudson, where every table was curated for photos and every smile could be converted into content. The air smelled of sea salt, perfume, and the faint tension of performance. Sloane arrived late, shimmering in silver satin that caught every flicker of candlelight. She kissed Evan's cheek as if the gesture had been choreographed. Her lipstick left no trace, her timing perfect. Guests clapped as she lifted a glass of champagne, laughing at something her maid of honor whispered. She was radiant, effortless, every inch the woman people expected her to be. Evan watched her from across the table, noticing how she modulated her tone depending on who she spoke to. The teasing warmth for friends, the polished gratitude for Beau Larkin, and his wife seated conveniently across the room. When Sloane looked at him, she did it the way an actress checks her lighting, assessing, not seeing. "You good, love?" she asked softly, her hand resting on his wrist for precisely 2 seconds. "Yeah," he said. It was the kind of lie that didn't need rehearsal. Through the dinner, toasts rose and dissolved into laughter. Evan heard words like power couple, vision, future. Each one felt like another coat of paint over rotting wood. Sloane leaned into him during speeches, head resting lightly on his shoulder, her smile calibrated for the camera flashes that blinked like tiny applause. When Beau raised his glass and said, "To partnerships that scale," the room erupted in cheer. Evan felt the burn of irony slide down his throat with the champagne. He tried to meet her eyes during dessert, to find something unscripted. but she was already scrolling through photos, selecting which angles to approve for posting. When she turned her phone toward him, her smile was impeccable. "This one's good, right? We look happy." He studied the image. They did look happy. Beautiful, composed, almost believable. He thought of the voice memo, of Beau's name in her inbox, of every manipulation disguised as optimization. And yet, beneath the betrayal, a smaller grief took root, that she no longer knew the difference between the image and the life it replaced. When the crowd thinned and the rooftop emptied, Evan stepped onto the balcony. The city sprawled beneath him, glittering and indifferent. His reflection in the glass door was that of a man rehearsing contentment. The ring in his pocket felt heavier than it should have, an object dense with expectation. He turned it between his fingers, the cool metal pressing against his skin like a question. Behind him, Sloane's laughter carried through the wind, mingling with music from a nearby bar. She sounded free, untouched by consequence. He imagined her rehearsing that same sound in front of a mirror, perfecting the rhythm until even she couldn't tell it was hollow. She joined him outside, draping an arm around his waist. "Almost there," she murmured. "One more night and then we're officially us." He looked at her, really looked, at the flawless skin, the steady eyes, the ambition coiled beneath her calm. "You ever get tired of pretending?" he asked quietly. She blinked, caught off guard. Pretending what? He wanted to say that this is love, but the words lodged behind his teeth. Instead, he smiled faintly. "Nothing. Just nerves." Sloane pressed a quick kiss to his jaw. "Don't overthink tonight, Ev. Tomorrow's about the story we tell." The story we tell. He let the phrase sink in like a bruise. When she returned inside to thank the staff, Evan slipped the ring from his pocket again. The city lights flickered off the band, tiny reflections of everything false and glittering. He considered leaving it there, on the tablecloth, next to her untouched dessert, as a quiet exit from the spectacle. But as the thought formed, another followed. Walking away now would make him another headline in her feed, another story she could control. He slid the ring back into his pocket, not out of forgiveness, but strategy. Truth, he realized, had to be timed like a revelation, not blurted in a fit of emotion, but released when silence had ripened into meaning. When they left the restaurant hand in hand, the photographers waiting outside caught them beneath the string lights, framed like a fairy tale. Sloane's head rested on his shoulder again, the picture of devotion. Only Evan knew that the man in that photo wasn't smiling at her. He was smiling at the quiet decision forming behind his ribs, the one that would outlast every caption and every lie. Morning light filtered through the hotel curtains, pale and sterile, softening nothing. The wedding day arrived like a verdict, silent, inevitable, wearing white. Evan woke before dawn, staring at the ceiling as the city hummed below, alive in its usual hurry. Across the suite, Sloane slept on her side, a silk mask covering her eyes, her breathing even and unbothered. The ring lay on the bedside table between them, glinting faintly in the gray light. He'd imagined this day once, how it would feel to stand beside her, to believe in the permanence of vows. Now it felt like walking toward an echo he no longer recognized. Downstairs, the venue in Brooklyn glowed with curated elegance. Sloane had chosen an industrial loft overlooking the East River. Raw brick, soft candles, and orchids imported from somewhere too far away to justify. Guests filtered in dressed in sleek neutrals, their laughter low and practiced. A string quartet rehearsed near the altar, their melody crisp, weightless, designed for ambiance rather than emotion. Evan stood behind the heavy oak doors waiting for his cue, his palms dry, his breath slow. He wasn't nervous. He was aware, acutely, painfully aware, of everything. The murmur of guests, the faint scent of perfume, the photographers adjusting lenses to capture perfection. He looked down at the ring in his hand. It gleamed like a promise carved from someone else's story. When the doors opened, the music swelled, and the guests rose to their feet. Sloane appeared at the end of the aisle, breathtaking in simplicity, ivory silk falling like water, her expression calm, composed, cinematic. Every head turned, cameras lifted, the air vibrated with admiration. Evan's chest tightened. He had loved her once with the blind devotion of a man who mistook performance for depth. Now, he saw her clearly, radiant, unreachable, the embodiment of a life that prized aesthetics over truth. She met his eyes halfway down the aisle, her smile precise, her pace steady. To everyone watching, it was the look of a woman walking toward her future. To him, it was the smile of someone protecting a brand. She reached him. The officiant began to speak, voice rehearsed, warm with practiced sincerity. Evan barely heard the words, union, commitment, forever. Each one landed like a foreign language. Sloane turned toward him, her eyes shimmering in the light. "You ready?" she whispered, the corner of her mouth lifting. Evan looked at her, really, looked. The flawless skin, the perfect posture, the ambition shining brighter than any candle in the room. And then he felt it, the clarity he'd been circling for months, sudden and absolute. He took her hands, steady and gentle. The room hushed, anticipating the vows. Instead, he slipped the ring from his pocket and placed it in her palm. His voice, when it came, was soft, but carried through the silence like confession. "You were right, Sloane," he said. "I'll never be enough. For the life you want, for the stage you've built. And I won't compete with a world that only exists in mirrors." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Her fingers closed instinctively around the ring, as if reflex could restore order. "Evan," she began, the syllables catching, but he was already stepping back. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't break anything. He didn't make a scene. The simplicity of his exit was its own rebellion. He turned, walked down the short aisle, the click of his shoes the only sound against the music that faltered mid-note. Behind him, whispers began to bloom. Questions, confusion, camera shutters hesitating between duty and disbelief. Outside, the wind off the river hit his face, cool and grounding. The city stretched before him, indifferent, honest. He stood for a moment, listening to the muffled chaos behind the doors. A year of pretense collapsed in seconds, yet what filled him wasn't loss. It was relief, clean and sharp. He walked away from the venue without looking back, passing the guests' luxury cars lined neatly along the curb, the catering truck, the florist still unloading stems. The world continued its rhythm, unbothered by one man's decision to choose truth over spectacle. By the time he reached the end of the block, the music had resumed behind him, someone trying to salvage the moment. He smiled faintly. The aisle had been short, but it had taken him years to walk it with his eyes open. The days after the wedding blurred into a strange quiet, like the pause after a storm that never quite arrives. Evan stayed in a short-term rental in Brooklyn. Bare walls, one chair, one mug, one lamp. The simplicity steadied him. He deleted every draft text he'd written to Sloane. No rage, no explanations. The silence itself became the cleanest form of goodbye. The city went on, unaware. News feeds filled with photos from other people's weddings, other curated joys. Sloane's social media accounts stayed active. Public relations required continuity, but there was an unmistakable shift in tone. She posted motivational quotes about growth through grace, then disappeared for a few weeks. No one mentioned his name. That, too, was part of her polish. Evan spent his mornings walking by the East River, coffee cooling in his hand, thinking about what kind of man he wanted to become in the aftermath. He wasn't driven by vengeance anymore, not in the loud, cinematic sense. What he wanted was a correction, a quiet restoration of balance. One night, he opened his laptop and scrolled through the folder he'd compiled months earlier, the evidence he'd almost deleted, the numbers she'd doctored to impress Beau's investors. The data was elegant in its deceit. Symmetrical engagement curves, inflated conversion ratios, organic metrics that were anything but. He could see his own fingerprints in the code, the small optimizations he'd done for her under the guise of efficiency. It was, in a way, his participation in her fraud. That realization hurt most. He drafted a concise, clinical report to the company's compliance division. No emotion, no accusation, just documentation, attachments, dates, logins. His tone was measured, professional. Possible data manipulation in influencer reporting. See enclosed. He read it twice before pressing send. When he did, the sound of the key clicking felt anticlimactic, but final. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't need to. Revenge, he realized, wasn't about spectacle. It was about truth left to speak for itself. Within weeks, the ripples began. Rumors of an internal audit. A few polite, evasive emails to former employees. Then, eventually, an article in a small business journal. Harrington Brand under investigation saw for reporting irregularities. The headline didn't name him. It didn't need to. He read it once and closed the tab. By then, Evan had already quit his job in ad tech. He'd grown allergic to the language of engagement and metrics, the endless performance of meaning. He joined a civic tech nonprofit based in Queens, working on open-source tools for public budget transparency. It wasn't glamorous, and the pay was modest, but the work made sense. The numbers here didn't lie. They exposed lies. His new office was a converted warehouse that smelled faintly of dust and printer ink. The people were earnest, unvarnished. No one cared about Instagram reach or investor dinners. They talked about access, accountability, community. For the first time in years, Evan felt something close to peace, the kind that doesn't perform itself. He spent his evenings coding quietly, the hum of the servers replacing the constant buzz of pretense. Sometimes he caught himself thinking about Sloane, where she might be, what stories she was spinning to survive the fallout. There was no joy in imagining her struggle, only a kind of distant empathy. They had both built illusions, but only one of them had mistaken the illusion for love. Months later, when he received an anonymous email from a former coworker confirming that compliance had acted on his report, he didn't feel triumph, just a stillness. The truth had done what it always does. It simply endured. He walked home that night through the rain, jacket damp, shoes squeaking against the sidewalk. In a storefront window, he caught his reflection, unshaven, tired, ordinary. But there was something different in his eyes, a steadiness that hadn't been there before. He thought about that short aisle in Brooklyn and how the walk hadn't ended at the church doors. It had stretched into this new life, this quiet act of reclamation. The revenge, he realized, had never been against her. It was against the version of himself that once believed dignity was something you earned through someone else's approval. Now, dignity was simply the act of not lying, to her, to the world, or to himself. By the time the investigation reached the headlines, the city had already moved on to another scandal. In New York, stories decayed quickly. Yesterday's downfall became today's breakfast reading. But for Sloane Harrington, the silence that followed wasn't relief. It was exposure in its purest form. The article came out on a Thursday morning. Regulatory inquiry targets Bo Larkin's investment group for data manipulation in marketing campaigns. No direct names, no photographs, just enough detail for anyone inside the industry to connect the dots. Within hours, Sloane's inbox filled with polite evasions, clients reevaluating budgets, partners pausing collaborations. The PR firm she had once mentored released a brief statement emphasizing commitment to ethical practice without mentioning her at all. It was the corporate equivalent of a closed door. She tried to perform calm. Her apartment, once the set of every perfect image, had grown smaller, tighter. The morning light no longer flattered the space. It revealed it. Candles burned down to stubs she never replaced. A vase of white lilies on the counter had begun to rot, their sweetness turning heavy. The world she had built through precision and control was collapsing, not with a crash, but with the soft, methodical sound of things being withdrawn. Sloane sat at her marble dining table, phone in hand, scrolling through the absence. Fewer emails, fewer calls. The algorithm had noticed before she did. Her posts no longer reached their usual millions. Engagement had cratered. The audience's loyalty as transactional as her own ambition had been. The followers who once begged for her authenticity now ghosted her feed like silent witnesses. She hadn't heard from Bo. His office line rang unanswered, and his assistant stopped returning messages. She'd watched a live business channel one morning as a reporter discussed leadership restructuring. The ticker tape below the screen scrolled past his name, paired with the phrase, "under review." She turned off the TV before she could see the footage of him leaving the building. At night, she couldn't sleep. She lay awake listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the city sirens faint through her window. Her mind replayed the sound of Evan's voice at the altar, soft, steady, unshakable. "I won't compete with a world built on impressions." She had expected him to rage, to humiliate her, to make a scene she could manage, spin, contain. But he hadn't. He'd simply left. His absence had become a mirror she couldn't edit. In the weeks that followed, she tried to pivot, to reinvent, to frame the fallout as a rebrand. She wrote long drafts of public statements. "Integrity has always guided my work. Growth begins where certainty ends." None of them felt true. Each attempt sounded like her old self speaking through a filter. The words clanged hollow against the quiet of her apartment. Sleep deprived and unraveling, Sloane began to notice details she used to overlook. The way the hardwood floor creaked at certain hours, the uneven hum of her building's pipes, the emptiness of her notifications. Every sound reminded her of a life she'd measured in applause. Now, stripped of it, she found herself measuring in minutes instead. How long she could sit still without reaching for her phone. How long before memory demanded attention. One night, she opened a hidden folder on her laptop labeled Personal. Inside were photos of her and Evan, most of them candid, taken before she started branding their lives. There was one image she didn't remember posing for. Evan sitting on their balcony, hair ruffled, coffee in hand, sunlight cutting across his face. She had captured him without performance, and the look in his eyes, calm, unguarded, was something she hadn't earned. Tears came unexpectedly, slow and quiet. Not for losing him exactly, but for realizing how completely he'd escaped her version of the world. He hadn't tried to destroy her. He had chosen something higher. Dignity, restraint, the kind of integrity she had mistaken for weakness. His revenge was silence, and it echoed louder than any scandal. In the mornings, she began to walk without her phone, just to feel the city without filter. The noise, the grit, the anonymity, all the things she used to frame out of her pictures. People passed her without recognition, and for the first time, it didn't sting. There was no redemption arc waiting, no sudden resurrection of career or status, just a woman relearning how to exist without an audience. And in that stripped-down existence, Sloane began to understand what Evan had known all along. The truth doesn't need to shout. It simply endures, patient and merciless, until the noise runs out. A year later, the city felt different. Not softer. New York never softened, but slower in its corners, like it had learned to breathe around him. Evan lived in a smaller apartment in Astoria now, the kind with peeling paint and a fire escape that doubled as a balcony. He liked the imperfection of it, the creak of the floorboards, the hum of neighbors' radios through the walls. It reminded him that life, when it wasn't curated, made a sound. He worked most days at the civic tech office, coding transparency tools with a handful of idealists who believed numbers could still serve the truth. In the quiet hum of servers and coffee machines, he'd found a kind of peace that didn't announce itself. His days were plain, honest, sustainable. But sometimes, when the sun slanted through the blinds a certain way, he'd catch himself thinking about her. Not the scandal, not the loss, but the memory of her laughter before it turned into performance. Memory has a way of erasing its own edges. It was on one of those mild October afternoons that he saw her again. He had ducked into a cafe on Prince Street during a sudden rain. She was already there, sitting near the window, hair shorter now, face unpainted. A book lay open in front of her, something she wasn't reading. When she looked up and saw him, her eyes widened not with surprise but with recognition, as if she'd been expecting the universe to eventually close its loop. Neither moved for a moment. The rain filled the silence between them. Then she gestured to the empty seat across from her. He hesitated, then walked over. Her voice, when it came, was softer than he remembered. "You look well." "So do you," he said, though it wasn't exactly true. She looked changed, thinner, quieter, realer. The gloss that used to follow her like light had dimmed, and what remained was human. They talked, awkwardly at first, about neutral things. Work, the city, how hard it was to find good coffee now that every shop doubled as a photo shoot. Then the pauses grew longer, the distance closing. "I heard about what happened," he said finally. Sloane nodded. "Most of it happened because I let it. I built a world that collapsed the moment someone stopped watching." She smiled faintly, but her eyes stayed steady. "And you—" She stopped herself, searching for words. "You didn't destroy it. You just stepped out. That was worse. It made the whole thing visible. Evan looked down at his hands. It wasn't meant to hurt you, he said quietly. I just couldn't live where truth had to audition. I know. Her voice broke on the second word. She took a slow breath. I used to think silence was weakness. Now I think it's the last honest language we have. They sat there for a while, watching the rain gather on the glass. There was no apology big enough to erase what had happened, no forgiveness that could rewrite it. But there was understanding, fragile, unadorned, enough to exist between two people who had once mistaken performance for love. When she reached for her cup, her hand brushed his. You ever regret walking away? She asked. He thought about it. The night air outside the church, the ring in her palm, the long months of rebuilding himself from the wreckage of her approval. No, he said. I regret how long it took me to start walking. Her eyes glistened, but she didn't look away. You were right, she said softly. The aisle was short. And the boundary? He asked. She smiled. A real one, small, almost shy. It's still holding. When they finally stood to leave, there were no promises, no scripted closure. He watched, her step into the street, umbrella catching the drizzle, her silhouette blurring into the crowd. She didn't look back. Neither did he. Outside, the rain had thinned to a mist. The city shimmered in gray light, ordinary and infinite. Evan walked home through it, unhurried. There were no more illusions to maintain, no ghosts to chase, just the steady rhythm of his footsteps and the quiet truth that forgiveness didn't mean return. The aisle, he realized, had ended long ago. But the boundary, the one built not from pride but from clarity, was what remained. And for the first time, it felt like freedom.